Good morning, everybody. We're going to start in about 1 minute from now. Just waiting for some others to log in, and then we'll go ahead. Thank you for joining. We'll be with you shortly. Okay. Um, so good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to welcome Dr. Chuck Freilich to our webinar. For those of you who don't know him, Chuck's had a long career in Israel's Ministry of Defense, as Foreign Affairs, and also as a Deputy National Security Advisor in the Prime Minister's office. He's taught at Tel Aviv University, Harvard University, NYU, and it's my great pleasure to announce that he will be the incoming Andrew Siegal Visiting Professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization next year. And his courses, which we'll put in the chat for students, will be cross-listed with security studies. There's a great deal more one can say, but I'll just say on a personal note, when I was serving in Jerusalem as a UN diplomat covering Israeli politics, and I came across his then, what was then a journal article in the Middle East journal, the article on national security decision making really was a revelatory moment for me, and in such an extremely saturated field. Dr. Freilich has really managed to distinguish himself by being the first to analyze Israel's decision-making process in the security sphere. I can't tell you how helpful it was in helping me try and explain the Israeli system to others who weren't familiar. So I'm extremely grateful to share a stage, and then also to have Dr. Freilich join us at the Center for Jewish Civilization next year. But beyond that, I would highly recommend his book on the subject, his first book, Zion's Dilemmas, and then his more recent on Israel's national security, a new strategy for an era of change, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. As I mentioned, next fall, he'll be teaching Israeli national security strategy, policy, and decision-making, primary issues and future dilemmas. A real tremendous opportunity for students to learn firsthand from a practitioner and an academic like Dr. Freilich. So today he'll be joining us. The topic will go a little bit beyond the topic, but the topic is really on Trump as a game changer or agent of chaos. I don't think there's really anyone better to help us think through this topic. We'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes or so, and then open it up to audience Q&A. There's a Q&A function on the webinar, so please make use of that, and then I'll do my best to get to the questions and moderate. But welcome, Dr. Freilich. Before we get into the topic, we talk about the U.S. and the Trump administration, maybe the Biden administration a little bit. I want to maybe start the discussion by asking you where we are after some 16 or so months into the war. What's the state of affairs on the ground in Israel as far as you see it? Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for Jonathan for hosting this event, and I'm honored to be an incoming fellow at the center at Georgetown. And I'm actually pleased to hear that article helped you understand the Israeli decision-making system, because I still have no idea what's going on. We're 18 months in. the longest war in Israel's history at this point, a war that started with the worst day in Israel's history, with a nothing less than catastrophic intelligence and operational failure. I've been studying it carefully and trying to understand what happened ever since. And just sometimes it is really quite remarkable how some pretty smart people can do some very, very dumb things. And it just should not have happened. The war not only starts with the massacre of October 7th, but with the fear that this is going to rapidly become a multi-front war, which it does. First of all, Hezbollah opens up fire big time the day after the Hamas attack. Not as big as they could have. They didn't go all out, but they got in significantly. And if Hamas turned out to be a much bigger threat than we had thought, we greatly underestimated them. Hezbollah was and still is a far greater threat. And there was some firing from Iraqi militias in Iran, Iranian militias in Iraq, of course, from the Houthis. There was the danger of the Syrian front opening up in a big way, and there were Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria. And in the course of this first year, there were two significant rounds with the Iranians themselves when they fired hundreds of missiles, in each case, missiles and drones at Israel. Well, what started off looking at like a catastrophic failure, in the fall, starting in last September, started turning actually into a major Israeli military success. By September, Hamas had been defeated militarily, and even more so since then. It hasn't been completely eliminated militarily, and certainly not politically, but it was defeated militarily by every conventional standard. Hezbollah was hit very, very hard in the Beeper attack, and then their leadership was taken out 2 weeks later, and at the same time, something like 70 to 80% of this really massive rocket and drone arsenal was taken out, something like 150,000 rockets. So 70, 80% of that, and a similar number out of a few thousand drones that they had. The regime in Syria collapsed. That's an enormous change. Syria was Iran's primary ally in the region. And Israel hit Iran very hard as well, taking out their air defense system and a significant portion of the ballistic missile capability. So that the axis of resistance, as it's called, the Iranian axis, actually is in ruin today. And from that point of view, from an overall strategic point of view, maybe Israel is in a much better position than it's been in decades. The other side of the story, though, of course, is that Hamas is reconstituting, and both sides are preparing for the next round. And we got some of the hostages home, but not all of them. Things seem to be, the ceasefire in Lebanon seems to be taking hold, but who knows? And there is a radical new regime in Syria, a Sunni fundamentalist one, which is at odds with Iran, which of course is good for Israel, but on the other hand, we don't know whether they will decide or when they will decide to heat up the Golan Heights front. So a very mixed picture at the end of 18 months.
No, thank you for that. I already have a number of questions, but maybe we'll go through and try and get to our topic as quickly as possible, and then maybe have you unpack some of this a little bit more. But maybe starting our look at U.S.-Israel relations, what can you say about the Biden administration's relationship with Israel? I think it was two phases, kind of before October 7th and after October 7th. But how do you see that, and what the legacy is?
Well, I think before October 7th, Israel and the U.S., not necessarily the Biden administration, but Israel and the U.S. were heading towards a crisis because generations of Americans have now grown up on a narrative of a very different Israel from what previous generations grew up on. The heroic early decades of Israel, pioneering Israel, the victor of 67. And in recent decades, of course, it's been Israel, the occupier, and at least according to some people, a brutal and racist country as well. Certainly on the Democratic side, and particularly the Democratic left, we had already seen a collapse in support before the war. And even within the Jewish community, we saw rising tensions and alienation, let me say, among a significant portion. The war changed things overnight, and it postponed that impending crisis. And now Trump will at least postpone it for a while. Again, we'll talk about Trump in a minute. But I think the basic problem will be with us, possibly during the Trump administration. Certainly, it could be under the successor administration, particularly if it's a Democratic one, but not only. But the war took what was already very close strategic cooperation between Israel and the US and took it to unprecedented levels. The president, to my way of thinking, responded magnificently. No one could have asked for more in Israel. He responded that within a day or two of the war, he had already declared that the US was sending in 2 aircraft carrier groups, and he immediately dispatched an airlift of weapons to Israel, and very strong diplomatic support. As a matter of fact, 3 vetoes and a 4th case where the U.S. abstained on a declaratory resolution. So really, the support was as wide as one could expect. It was in all areas, and it was very deep. And in the course of the war, we also had 2 unprecedented events where, for the first time ever, the U.S. and Israel conducted joint combat operations to deal with the Iranian missile drone attack in April, and again with the attack in October. And the first one was completely neutered, and the second one largely so. So, I mean, I think Israel owes President Biden a huge debt for what he did. He had said he was the first Zionist president, and I think he proved. But in the last half year or so, more than that, let's say last 3/4 of a year, I think largely because he was responding to pressures from within the Democratic Party, he did start putting pressure on Israel maybe in some legitimate and constructive ways, how to limit the way the war was being fought. But I think there were also some mistakes. For example, insisting that Israel not go into Rafah and then imposing sanctions over that. The U.S. turned out to be wrong about that. The casualties were not large, and the civilians were moved out of the area very quickly, and the military side of it was quite successful. There was also growing diplomatic pressure. There was pressure on the humanitarian issue, on I think too much pressure on the issue of casualties, not civilians. Not that I don't think that one should try and prevent civilian casualties, but the nature of this war is such that there was really no other way of waging it. So you can debate whether he went a little bit too far or not in the final months, but again, I don't think Israel's ever had a better one. Can't hear you. You're muted, John.
Forgive me, I muted myself. The sin of the moderator here. Okay, but no, but thank you, and really, I think a good segue into sort of the meat of the discussion today. And given that we've established you're an expert on chaotic decision-making processes that no one really understands, not even yourself. But then looking at Trump's first weeks in office, how do you see the first few weeks? How do you forecast what we might expect, both in terms of the bilateral relationship and maybe the new administration's regional policy more generally, and how that might impact Israel?
Well, if I have difficulty still in understanding Israeli decision making, then understanding the Trumpian chaotic approach is an even bigger challenge. Look, first of all, you have to step back for a minute and talk about his first term, which in many ways was very, very good for Israel. He brought us the Abraham Accords, the peace agreements with the Emirates, with Bahrain, and with Morocco. Now, there was criticism at the time, well, it didn't do anything on the Palestinian issue. And that's true, it's a valid criticism, but I'll take peace wherever I can get it, and we'll deal with the Palestinian issue at another time. Okay. That was a huge breakthrough, significant change in the entire regional outlook, and at the time maybe he was already thinking, now he's certainly thinking about broader normalization with the Saudis and other, and that's really a different Middle East. He recognized Israeli control of the Golan Heights, Israel's sovereignty over the Golan. To my way of thinking, it was something that had to be done. I don't think there's anyone in the world who really expects Israel to withdraw from the Golan. It's not going to happen, and in this case, other states should follow his lead. He recognized Israel's capital, Jerusalem, as the capital. It always has been, and it always will be. Congress actually passed legislation in 1995 instructing the president to move the embassy to Jerusalem, to recognize it. And every president from 95 until Trump did it refused to do so. So that was the good side from Israel's point of view. He also withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which I think was a catastrophic mistake. And the reason that today that Iran has become a nuclear threshold state and can cross it at any time. Right, the first few weeks in this term were a bit chaotic. He started even before entering office, literally in the days leading up to January 20th, with the successes that he threatened that there would be all hell to pay. And he put pressure, well, we thought the pressure was going to be mostly on Hamas. I think it ended up being mostly on Israel, but it led to that hostage deal, which has gotten a lot of people back home. That was a good thing. He talks a hard line on Iran, clearly wants a deal, which is fine by me. That's the way to conduct effective negotiations, when you sound like you've got a big stick, even if you don't really mean to use it. And a deal, I think, is the best, still the best of the bad options. He lifted some of those restrictions that the sanctions that Biden had imposed in the last few months, seemed to be willing to give Israel a free hand in Gaza and the Lebanese arena. In point of fact, I think his objective is different. He actually wants peace and quiet. He wants another peace deal so that he can get a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, because the strategic objective is what was Biden's deal, and which he'll now repackage as his own, of course, Israeli-Saudi normalization. That leads to a breakthrough in US-Saudi relations, including both the defense treaty that the Saudis want and the $600 billion in investments and procurements that the Saudis promised from the US that Washington wants. And of course, the problem here is that the Saudi conditions for normalizing relations with Israel is Israeli agreement to recognize a Palestinian state. And the question now is whether we can go back to what was the situation before Trump, a few months ago, a half a year ago, when the Saudis were really looking for some sort of vague wording. If Netanyahu was willing today to come up with some sort of vague wording. And here I think Trump can put pressure on the sides to go forward. Certainly Israel, especially after the Zelensky debacle in the Oval Office, I think Netanyahu is going to be very, 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 very careful with him. But he also came up with this idea of relocating, forcing out, whatever you want to call it, over 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. Now, it's a proposal which was dead on arrival. Okay, it's a total non-starter for the entire Arab world. It's of course a non-starter for the Palestinians. And I don't think American presidents should be coming out with proposals that have absolutely no chance of going anywhere. But there was one positive aspect. And Trump's maybe general great disruptor approach. When you're a disruptor, you can cause real disruption and even destruction. You can also sometimes force people to think about things differently. Now, Gaza, in its current borders, the population doubles about every 20 years, meaning that the current 2 point something in 20 years will be 4 something, close to 5 million. And 20 years later there, it'll be close to 10 million. Gaza simply, this isn't a political statement now. Gaza is not viable socioeconomically in its current territory. And so you have to think, well, what can you do? One thing is you can try and reduce the population size, as Trump was suggesting, or maybe you have to play around with Gaza's borders and expand them. And so there's an idea, we can talk maybe about how we go forward in the peace process. One of the ideas is a multilateral land swap, which would double Gaza's size, make it a viable place. Egypt gives some land to Israel, Israel compensates, Egypt gives land to Gaza, Israel compensates Egypt, and then the Palestinians, because if you work it out, now Israel has lost some territory, the Palestinians compensate Israel on the West Bank, giving it the few percent that it has to, or that it wants to annex, to be able to keep 80% of the settlement. Well, in any event, I'm getting ahead of myself. What he does here is he's forced the Arab world and others to start taking a different look at Gaza, and I think that actually is a good thing.
No, thank you. Again, lots of questions. I mean, but I'm thinking then maybe if you could zero in on the domestic scene in Israel, and from what we understand, at least in the distance that we have, this notion of Netanyahu's popularity, his ability to hold on to power. What, if any, opposition may or may not exist, and also, what the sort of Trump effect has been on internal politics. I agree with you, and I think that the reaction of all of the world pretty much to Trump's proposal was to sort of recoil either in disbelief or horror or a combination of the two at his proposal, but it seems that there are elements within Israel and within the Israeli government that are sort of taking it seriously. What do we make of that when we read statements from ministers, from the defense ministry, from Idit Sliman and other characters? What should we make of that, and how do we understand that from looking at it from the distance here?
Politics in all countries, democratic countries, and certainly in Israel, are partly a matter of theater, and not to be taken too seriously. Some of the statements are very disturbing. Some would almost be comical if they weren't disturbing. It doesn't matter what Idit Sliman says or what various other people say. In the end, there's really one person calling the shots at the moment, and that's Netanyahu. And the question is, will his coalition hold in there? The next elections are scheduled for, or must be no later than November 26th. And being a parliamentary system, of course, they can be moved up if either the coalition collapses or Netanyahu calls early election. And no Israeli government has ever lived its full 48 months. So let's put it this way. I think it's unlikely that it'll go beyond summer of 26, maybe spring 26. At the moment, the polls show in the last few months, partly because of the military successes of the fall that I was talking about, partly because Trump came into office and The tensions with the U.S. Disappeared, partly because the hostages were coming home. The mood in Israel improved, and we saw a strengthening in Netanyahu standing in the polls. Well, the hostages were coming home, they're not now. And that's one issue in which there is a consensus in Israel, that we have to bring the hostages home. But it looks like the entire political landscape in Israel is going to be reshaped dramatically by the time the next elections take place. And the polls also, when they show it with the other candidates potentially running new parties, they show a very different outcome. Today, Netanyahu might or might not be able to form a coalition. It would be iffy. Naftali Bennett, who was prime minister for about a year, is going to come back. And he will probably come back with the largest party or the second largest party, but with the best shot at forming a coalition. That in itself has had the Likud and the right-wing coalition running scared for the last couple of months. Last week, an apparent agreement was reached between Gadi Eisenkot, the former chief of staff, who is very popular, and Yair Lapid, the head of the center-left Yesh Atid party, to run together. That will badly hurt Benny Gantz, but it may create a new powerful center-left body. So it's very hard to really forecast what's going to happen. Given all these changes, I think that there's a very good chance that there will be a new government within a year and a half.
Okay, no, thank you so much. I'll just ask the audience to start sending in questions into the Q&A function, not to the chat, just to remind you. But I have a couple of more questions as we continue. I think looking at all of this and maybe turning back, and thanks for that insight into the Israeli system, but turning back to the U.S. I mean, maybe looking at U.S. politics, is for the future of support to Israel. I mean, is it? Can we call support to Israel a bipartisan issue? Is that changing? Is that no longer the case? And if not, what do you think the implications of that might be?
Well, tragically, I think the answer is no. We can no longer really call it bipartisan. And a couple of polls came out last week, and I didn't read the details yet, but show that the collapse in support is even worse than we had known. To me, that is very worrisome, because one of the secrets of this really unique relationship between the U.S. and Israel, there aren't many countries that have as close a relationship. One of the secrets of it was that Israel always was a bipartisan issue. That's not the case today. The Republicans are increasingly strongly pro-Israel, and the Democratic Party, certainly the left part of the party, is growing increasingly. It's no longer alienated, it's anti-Israel. And we see it especially among young people. And again, we see it within the Jewish community as well. Look, I think the relationship with the United States is existential for Israel. Nothing less than existential. I think one way or the other we'll work things out with the Iranians. And we'll handle the issue, including the nuclear issue. One way or another, we'll handle the various Palestinian issues. We'll deal with Hezbollah, we'll deal with other threats. The one thing that Israel simply cannot afford to allow is a deterioration of any significance in the relationship with the United States, because that affects everything. Israel's ability to deal with Iran, to deal with Hezbollah, to deal with the Palestinians in Gaza, everything. And half the Jewish people live in the United States, half in Israel, rounding off the figures. There is a very close and important relationship from that point of view. And there always has been a very close relationship between the American people writ large and Israel. And all of that is really at stake today. And what I'm very worried about, yes, Trump was and so far has been very good for Israel. And some people might say too good. He didn't have to give us all the carrots that he did in his first term. I'm scared of a Ukrainianization, if I can call it that, of Israel. Now, I think Bibi, if he didn't know beforehand, I'm sure he learned from the Zelensky lesson, but could Trump turn on a dime against Israel? Well, what happens if Israel does block? I mean, we have an ultra right-wing coalition, far more than I think Bibi himself would like to be, but that's where he is. What happens if the U.S. believes that Israel is blocking the hostage deal, or if Israel is blocking if Israel leads to a renewal of the fighting in Gaza, which could very much happen, and prevents the American goal of achieving a long-term ceasefire? What happens if Bibi is not willing to make the concessions needed to enable the normalization with the Saudis and the U.S.-Saudi deals? What happens if, on the Iranian issue, if Israel doesn't say, oh, wow, a deal that the president maybe reached is a fantastic deal and we support it wholeheartedly? Or if Israel feels that the nuclear program has gotten to the point that it has absolutely no alternative but to attack, and that disrupts, I think, what is Trump's objective of trying to keep quiet in the Mideast, so he can deal with, first of all, so he can deal with domestic issues, but in the foreign affairs realm, so it can deal with China, and Russia, Ukraine. So I think there could be, that's what I'm worried about. Oh, and just one more sentence. First of all, there's the annual aid that the U.S. provides. And it's part of a 10-year aid package that ends in 2028. What happens from 29 and on? Well, if Israel wants another 10-year deal, talks have to start this year or next year at the latest. Is Trump going to agree to that? Will the Republican Party support that?
So then is Trump still interested in the, you mentioned Saudi normalization, everything like that, but is the sort of deal of the century 2.0, if you will, is that still something that's on the table? And if so, maybe combining the last couple of questions, what would that do to Israeli politics? What would that do, to how would a Netanyahu government in its current configuration respond?
Well, probably negatively, and that could probably bring the coalition down. I do think that Trump wants a Nobel Prize. Now, he might want it for a Ukraine deal, and he might want it for an Israeli-Palestinian deal. The man has gotten or enjoyed every other privilege in life. Okay, he was born rich, maybe became richer. Subsequently, he's been president of the United States, not a bad position, lots of power, and he's had a, shall we say, interesting personal life. The one thing he hasn't yet gotten, the ultimate accolade, is a Nobel Peace Prize. So I think he really wants that. I think he wants this Saudi investment in the U.S. It's a lot of money. He wants to stabilize the region. And if there is a peace agreement, or just progress towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and if there's Israeli-Saudi normalization, then he can build it's not an alliance, but it's the alignment between the Sunni and especially the Gulf countries and Israel that was already evolving under Biden. And it can become institutionalized. So, I mean, there are serious strategic reasons for wanting to do this, putting aside personal ambition for the president. So, I mean, I think there's a good chance that we'll see a deal of the century 2.0. Now, remember, the 1.0 plan was rejected by both sides, even though originally Bibi was sort of a partial architect of it. Because it was actually a joint U.S.-Israeli worked-out deal. But what ended up happening is not only the Palestinians rejected it because it gave Israel 30% of the West Bank, whereas no earlier proposal had given Israel more than something 4, 5, 6%. So to a certain extent, it was a great deal from Israel's perspective, which is why Bibi had originally agreed. But then when it was actually presented publicly, his right-wing party, which wasn't a coalition, which wasn't as right-wing as the current one, said, no way. What, only 30%? We want much more than that. So yeah, this could be a big disruptor and have a big impact on politics in Israel. And also take into account that since October 7th, most of the left no longer believes that a two-state solution is viable. Because if Israel, what does Israel really want in any deal? It's security. And if what happened on the Gaza border could happen, Israel can't risk it happening on the West Bank border, which abuts all of the major populations there. So it'll be controversial. It'll be controversial for the left and the right, not just the right.
No, absolutely. Okay, there's a couple of questions sort of on the regional. I'll try and combine maybe and do some editorial control here if that's okay. But maybe we could start with the news about this, a potential deal on Lebanon. You mentioned the ceasefire, that the ceasefire is holding, and that we saw a news item. I think it was just yesterday that there's potentially an agreement to start negotiating on the border, the land border. What is the significance of this, and what is the how do you from the national, putting on your old national security hat, the Lebanon theater, Hezbollah's position, and internal Lebanese politics? Of course, it's all related to the different changes in the region. You mentioned Syria, et cetera. But how do you think Israel's security structures are looking at Lebanon right now?
So the defeat or the severe blow that Hezbollah suffered, the blow that Iran suffered, fed into the collapse of, it's not a direct causal relationship, but it certainly fed into the collapse of the Syrian regime and fed into the governmental change that we've seen in Lebanon and the election of Mr. Aoun as the prime minister, as the president. Yes, as the president and the new prime minister as well. Hezbollah has been weakened dramatically in the political arena in Lebanon as well, and we see new openings. The political debate within Lebanon has changed because people now say, for the first time since the 1980s, maybe we have some room for maneuver here, some freedom of maneuver. We're not subject to Hezbollah anymore. They don't have a veto or control over everything that's happening in the country. And so Aoun has said some more moderate things publicly since being elected. And apparently the atmosphere in the talks with Israel has been more positive. And so, and now the negotiations are going to begin. And now there's maybe a feeling in Israel that, for example, one of the demands that Lebanon, it's really that Hezbollah had over the years, was so-called border correction. Now, in some cases, they were probably right, but the Israeli fear was that even if you accept the legitimate ones, then he will then come up with a list of another 100 other ones which aren't legitimate. Well, now maybe there's a government in Lebanon who's bona fide you can count on, that it'll be legitimate demands, and we can talk about it. And I must say, quite surprisingly, Witkoff, a couple of the president's special Mideast advisor, said a statement that I found almost astounding. Is he said, well, we want to get Syria and Lebanon to be part of the Abraham Accord. Well, I think he's still way ahead of himself for both countries, certainly Syria, but even Lebanon. But Israel was talking, the Israeli press today is talking about normalization with Lebanon. Again, I think we're all getting ahead of ourselves, but there is, for the first time, and this weakening of Hezbollah does pave the way for an improvement in Israeli-Lebanese relations, and hopefully long-term quiet on the Lebanese border. But on the other hand, Hezbollah will do everything it can to reconstitute itself, and Iran will do everything that it can to support that. It'll certainly take them a while to rebuild the arsenal, the missiles, the drones. But okay, so in a few years from now, we could find ourselves back in a similar situation.
No, it's fascinating, and I think that as we, see this, I don't even know how to describe it. If it's even cautious optimism, or maybe some potentially good news on the northern theater, especially given the events of the last year. Maybe if I could ask you to then look at maybe Israel's arguably second most important or second most strategic relationship, which is of course with Egypt since 1979, and we read about tensions, and of course a lot of this is Gaza related, but is this a serious? Is the relationship in trouble? Or is this just a sort of tension related to the ongoing difficulties of the discussions on the ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, it's certainly directly related to the whole Gaza issue and the Egyptian demand that Israel withdraw from the so-called Philadelphia corridor, the Egyptian Gaza border, which Israel was in control of now following the war. The Egyptians are afraid that, given what's happening in Gaza, there could be a massive outflow of Gazans into Egypt. And Egypt has enough trouble of its own with its existing population, which is exploding. They don't want that. They don't want a Palestinian population, which could be potentially hostile to them and certainly hostile to Israel, and a Hamas, let's say, a galvanized population, which might use the safety of their presence in Egypt to renew the fighting with Israel. So the Egyptians have got some serious and legitimate concerns here. I think, though, whenever you hear voices in Egypt talking about a threat to the peace treaty, though usually they're not the central and the most important voices, but there shouldn't be any voices like that because we signed a peace treaty and it's not conditional. My personal assessment is that Sisi has no intention of ending the peace treaty unless he's forced into something by extreme circumstance. But the relationship with Egypt is crucial. Just having peace and quiet on the border. The peace treaty with Egypt revolutionized Israel's national security circumstances. It took the biggest, most powerful enemy out of the war. And since then, by the way, the Syrians were the first ones to understand when this treaty was signed, way before Israel did it, that the Arab states no longer had a military option against Israel anymore, because if they couldn't win with Egypt, they certainly couldn't win without Egypt. And it's not by chance that we haven't had a conventional war since the peace treaty with Egypt, or since '73, in fact. So, and it allowed Israel to transfer resources, budgetary, personnel, etc., to the other fronts, which evolved over time. So, I mean, it's hard to overstate the importance of the peace treaty with Egypt. And I mean, I hope we get over these tensions. There was very good, quiet, under the radar military and strategic cooperation with Egypt in recent years. Very good, to the point that apparently in about 2018, I could be off by a year or so on at this point, the Egyptians actually asked Israel to send in the Air Force to bomb ISIS positions in Sinai because they weren't succeeding in doing it themselves. I mean, countries don't normally ask any other country, certainly not a former enemy, to violate their airspace and attack targets in their territory. And there were all sorts of other things happening. So I hope we can get past these tensions. And it would also be nice if we could warm up the relationship between the two countries in general, trade, tourism, things like that.
Oh, thank you for that. So just a few questions here that that have come my way. What will it take to get an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, in your opinion?
Look, Israel had basically withdrawn from Gaza most of it already a year ago. The presence was quite limited in terms of areas. Now, Israel went in again to Rafah, and into one or two other areas in northern Gaza, but it had basically withdrawn. And then, for a whole variety of reasons, partly because Hamas was reconstituting, was talking about going in again now. Israel isn't in Gaza very much at this point. Again, it's the Philadelphia corridor. It's along the border itself, a 700 to 1,000 meter buffer zone along the border. That is or isn't going to withdraw from, I don't believe. But the Philadelphia and the other areas where there is a small presence today, it will require a hostage deal and probably some American pressure. I don't think it's contingent on getting another government in place or getting international or Arab forces deployed. I don't think that's going to happen. So, I mean, I think Netanyahu wants that. He would like to be able to get out. And this is to get back to your earlier question, by the way, is I mean, the ultra-right elements in the coalition are fighting that because they want Israel to stay in Gaza and actually rebuild the settlements that were dismantled under the withdrawal in 2005. I think the chances of that happening are pretty meager. And I think sooner or later, except for the buffer zone, we probably will be out of them.
And then looking back at the internal situation, you mentioned Bennett, but is there anyone else? Is there any other personalities in Israel, or maybe a reconstituted peace movement or something like that that might emerge? You mentioned the sort of disillusionment of the traditional left, the sort of, you know, what was basically labor, Meretz, I suppose. But do you see anything sort of bubbling under the surface that might be worth watching?
Well, first of all, it's broader than what you're calling the traditional left or labor. And it's everything from the center right to the pretty much far left today. I'm not talking about the fringe, but let's say truly dovish opinion. People do not believe that the two-state solution is viable. They don't believe it because they don't believe that the Palestinians are capable of saying yes, of making the concessions that they have to make, because they don't believe that the Israeli government is capable of doing it. And even if both sides were, they've got the problem that I said before. They no longer believe that viable security guarantees can be achieved. And if you can't achieve that, there's no basis for an agreement. Okay, having said that, we did see, for example, you're talking about who are some of the other elements, not under the surface. Yair Golan, who was the head of what was a combination of labor and Meretz. It's now called not the Democratic, but the Democrats Party. He was polling up to 14 seats in the polls in recent months. For a first-time party, that's remarkable, especially one which still sort of talks about a two-state solution. And Golan says that he supports it, but he doesn't really think it's viable for the immediate future. But he was a rising star. If we see not just Bennett, he'll still be do very well if Bennett runs, but if Eisenkot and Lapid join forces, that will greatly reduce the number of seats that he gets. But in any event, it's early at this point to be projecting forward too much, because we're going to see a whole bunch of new faces in the new elections, and we'll see new parties, and we'll see how it plays out. The problem, there is a real problem today. Of course, the right never believed, or the hard right never believed in the two-state solution. And today, the center right to the left no longer believe that it's viable. So how do we go forward on the Palestinian issue? I've put forward a proposal for a confederation and a multilateral land swap. And if you'd like, I can talk about that. But I think the classic two-state solution, of which I was a lifelong supporter, I don't think it's viable anymore.
Well, maybe I'll ask you to do that before we end. But there's one more question, and I think it's related. So maybe you can maybe tackle both. I mean, there's a question on the partnership with the Palestinian Authority, and so Israel's objections to the Palestinian Authority being tapped to be the alternative administration in Gaza, but of course, at the same time, the security coordination in the West Bank continues. Maybe you could characterize for us the relationship, the current relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority?
I'm trying to think if there's some good expression that would encapsulate. Like it's a very mixed relationship. The hard right hates the Palestinian Authority, the PA, and wants to see it disappear from the face of the earth. But the hard to even moderate right, let's say the semi-rational hard right, and the rest of the more rational right, moderate, all recognize that actually Israel needs the PA to run the place, the Gaza, and the security cooperation is very good. It has prevented the loss of umpteen Israeli lives. So in the West Bank, it's a mixed picture, and there's rising terrorism there, so Israel's been going in more. And that, of course, complicated the relationship. And this PA was let's say, marginally competent government in its heyday, and it's far from its heyday today. Not very effective, and is extraordinarily unpopular among the Palestinian population. To my way of thinking, we probably share this, and a lot of other people, that it was the only likely candidate to take over from Hamas in Gaza. Not that it had the capability to do so, it doesn't. Remember, anybody who goes into Gaza today, it's not a peacekeeping mission or the Palestinian Authority taking over from its Palestinian brethren, Hamas. It's a war zone, and you have to be willing to fight a war there. So even if they were an effective governing body for socioeconomic policy, they simply don't have the military capability to take over Gaza, right? So people said, well, maybe an Arab and international force could backstop them, could do the fighting for them. I don't see the long list of countries volunteering to do that. I'm forgetting part of your question. I mean, that was the...
Just on, we were talking about security cooperation in the West Bank as well, and just the relationship with the PA. But
okay,
but
I think
but I'm happy to, because right on cue, of course, and we have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to offer you an opportunity because we just had a question pop up in the chat. If you say the two-state solution is no longer viable, what is the alternative?
So, I mean, first of all, let me say, even if I think it's not viable, I think separation between Israel and the Palestinians is Israel's foremost national security objective. It's the most important issue we face. And so what I've proposed is a three-part framework proposal. I wrote an op-ed about it in Haaretz a couple of weeks ago, and I'm now just about putting the final touches on a in-depth article that I'll hopefully publish soon. The idea is, first of all, a confederation between Jordan and the Palestinians. The Palestinian part of the confederation would be 90+% of the West Bank and all of Gaza. Now, it turns out the issue of a Palestinian-Jordanian confederation has been discussed between those two sides on repeated occasions, and in the past, at least, they had repeatedly said, yeah, we're interested in it. The Palestinians always said, but first we have to declare independence, and then we can join the confederation. But there was a lot of talk about it. And in the past, Jordan spoke about it favorably as well. Today, I don't think that's the case. I think Jordan would say absolutely no way. So why am I proposing this? Because I think what we can do is we can put safeguards into the constitution of the confederation that would ensure, first of all, the Constitution would explicitly state that the Hashemite kingdom will remain, that Jordan will remain the Hashemite kingdom forever, in perpetuity. and the king would enjoy a veto over decisions. Let's say there'll be a joint parliament, there'll be a joint cabinet. The king would retain a veto power over decisions that might threaten the existence of the Hashemite kingdom or the fundamental stability of the confederation and external relations, peace with other countries, meaning peace with Israel. So the Jordanians would retain ultimate security control, although the Palestinian forces would be integrated over not a lot of time into a national security force. Israel would be able to approach this with at least somewhat more confidence, because if Jordan is in charge of security, they've got a good record, a very good record. They've kept the common border almost totally quiescent for decades. Again, I think this is something that the Palestinians can accept. It could be it's a kind of two-state solution. It's a different one. That's the first component. The second component is, how do we make Gaza a viable place? And there's this idea of the multilateral land swap that I discussed before. Articles have been written about this. In the past, the Egyptians rejected the idea outright. Egypt's got a particular national sensitivity to territory, maybe because of their colonial history, or for other reasons in their history. But this is a proposal where, yes, it's a land swap, but they don't lose an inch of territory. None of the sides gain territory in this swap that I'm talking about. But the Palestinians gain territory where they really need it, which is on the Gaza border. Not that they don't need it in the West Bank, but where they really need it is Gaza. And Israel gets an exchange to keep a few percent of the West Bank. Then it needs to be able to keep about 80% of the settlers, making its ability to withdraw from the West Bank, for most of it at least, from the 90-odd% that I'm saying, that much easier, much, much easier. The third component, and this would be a means of kicking off the entire process, a confidence-building measure, an indication to the Palestinians, to the world, that Israel is serious about going ahead. There's a proposal known as civil withdrawal from the West Bank. The idea is that Israel would again say, we don't have claims to the 90-whatever% of the West Bank, and we will begin withdrawing settlers from that area, from that 90-something%. But the IDF will remain deployed for military purposes as deemed necessary, for as long as necessary, until there's a final peace agreement. Under my proposal, this would be a step leading towards the confederation idea. So that's the proposal I'm talking about. I'm sure there are other equally, if not better, ideas than mine. And by the way, this is I took existing ideas and what's new about my proposal, just putting these three things together. But again, I think we all have to think differently about what a peace agreement is going to look like. And here, Trump's disruption approach to things, the disregard for what everybody's always known to be absolutely true, can actually play in favor, because one of the problems, two states has become an international mantra. How do you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Two states, two states, two states. At a minimum, we have to think of other ways. And maybe in the end, we'll come back to this. Maybe we'll conclude that it is, but for the first time in a long time, we have to start looking at the other options very seriously. And again, I say that with pain because I've been a lifelong supporter of the two-state solution.
Wonderful. So there's a request that we share your article with the attendees. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. And thank you very much for that. Just as we're just past 10 now, so really a tremendous amount of food for thought. I think you've left us with more questions in some ways than answers, that as is the nature of this topic. But of course, I think maybe just scratching the surface for this issue that we can explore further, hopefully, when you come to campus and are teaching with us, which we really look forward to. So again, Chuck, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to seeing you in Washington come next fall.
I thank you for this, and I very much look forward to the fall, to being at Georgetown.
Okay. All the best. Thank you so much, Chuck. Thank you, everybody, for joining.